Dr. Golden is a visiting professor of philosophy at Whitman College in Walla Walla. His areas of academic specialization are philosophical theology, 19th and 20th century European philosophy, and Africana philosophy, African American philosophy, critical race theory, and black male studies. He is the author of Frederick Douglass and the Philosophy of Religion, an interpretation of narrative art and the political, and editor of Racism and Resistance. Essays on Derek Bell's Racial Realism in the State of New York, University of New York Press, 2022. Dr. Golden is a national speaker on men's mental health. His TED Talk, Suffering in Silence, The Emotional Abuse of Men, has more than 1.5 million views on YouTube. Dr. Golden is also an actor with expression in solo performances as Thurgood Marshall. Some people say, yeah. He's like, yeah, we know that. Thurgood and August Wilson. How I Learned What I Learned. He has performed in both Shakespeare and August Wilson plays, including roles as Shylock, am I reading right? Shylock, and Shakespeare's Merchant of Venus, and Whining Boy in August Wilson's The Piano Lesson. Dr. Golden has nearly 20 years of experience as a practicing lawyer and is a regular contributor to discussion on law, religion, and politics to the Travis Smiley's nationally syndicated radio program on KBLA Radio in Los Angeles, California. So we praise God for Dr. Golden being here with us. Let's give him a hand clap. We're going to have a quick word of prayer. We'll ask him to come on up. Father, we thank you again for this privilege of being able to learn what we need to learn in order to navigate the season that we're in. And Father, we just pray that you bless Dr. Golden as he speaks to us. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Pastor Jones, for that very kind introduction. You know, between the spiritual food of that Michael Taylor delivered us earlier today and the temple food I just ate, I'm ready for a nap in Jesus' name. But I came out here, and that means God has something for me to do. I want to thank Pastor Jones for inviting me. I want to thank Giselle Thomas for her logistical help and making hotel arrangements and so forth. And thank all of you for coming back here this afternoon. So let's open up our Bibles. And I'm not going to take you far in the Bible. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14. Let's read verses 14 through 16. I will read in your hearing. I'm reading from the King James Version. Genesis 1, verses 14 through 16. We got it? Amen. Okay. The Bible says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. If you're thankful that when God says it, it's so, you ought to say hallelujah. Hallelujah. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. I want you to think with me this afternoon for the next few moments from the subject, the jurisdiction of history. The jurisdiction of history. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this moment. We thank you for this opportunity to reflect on your word on your Sabbath day. We pray that you would prepare our hearts and minds to receive what you have in store for us. In Jesus' name, amen. When I was on my way to church this morning, it was overcast, and I was fumbling with a number of things. I need a bag just to carry stuff, right? And thank you very much. Should I stay here? Is this where I need to be? Oh, good, okay, all right, thank you. So I was on my way here this morning, and I was fumbling with things, and I was fumbling with a pair of sunglasses, and I looked up at the sky, and I said, well, I don't even need those, because, the sun's not really out. But I look now, and the sun is outside just in time for me to talk about history and history's authority. So I see a couple lawyers here. Jurisdiction, that's what that means. It means power and authority. So when a court has jurisdiction over you, you have to answer to what the court is trying to get out of your case. And so you might be asking, what does the sun have to do with history? And what does the sun have to do with the 4th of July? Well, after church, when we're done today, and you go outside and you take a walk in the sunshine, in case you didn't know, as the sun that hits your hands and your face, that warms you and makes you feel comfortable, this time of year probably makes you feel uncomfortable. You're not experiencing that light as it is. The light that is warming your body is light that left the sun 8 minutes ago. So you are literally living in the past. You are walking in history. If you want to really get interesting, tonight, go outside. And if it's a clear night and you look up at the stars, you will see the stars and they appear to be shining. But the light that you see as the star in the sky has already burned out a long time ago. So whether it is day or night, we are surrounded by history. Now, we are told that God made the lights and that he also made the stars. Now, the stars are interesting because they have a composition that almost reflects the composition of you and I. In order for a star to shine, it has to attain a state that astronomers call hydrostatic equilibrium, which means that the gases inside the star have to generate enough pressure to prevent the external force of gravity from collapsing the star. So what is inside has to be able to neutralize what is on the outside in order for the star to shine. There's about 14 pounds of pressure exerting itself on our bodies right now. But our skeletal system provides enough force on the inside to neutralize that pressure. That's why nobody can go to the bottom of the ocean without getting crushed, because the external pressure is too much. And our skeletal system is only able to withstand about 14 pounds of pressure in the Earth's atmosphere. What am I saying, and what does all of this have to do with what we're talking about today? Do you realize that the history of black people is a history of human hydrostatic equilibrium? That we have had enough on the inside to neutralize the forces on the outside that have been steadily trying to collapse us. I had a conversation with someone over lunch, and one of the things I said is that we've been through worse before, right? So if you really want to shine, you gotta fortify yourself from the inside out, right? Now, this connection to history is deeper, I think, than we care to admit, because the central feature of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that we serve a God who pays attention to history. The eternal God became historical in the person of Jesus Christ in order to save us. Our salvation is the result of God not making humankind and then withdrawing and retreating, but our salvation is the result of a God who made us in love, and despite our failures, came back to deliver us in love. And I can't help but think that the same God of Genesis 1:14, who hung lights in the heavens and made the stars, hangs those things in the sky as a mercy to remind us never to forget about history. So the next time somebody tells you to stop living in the past, you tell them to go take a walk in the sunshine. We can't get around the past. We serve a God who doesn't want to get around the past. And if we are to emulate God, then we must be as attentive to history as he is. Because, listen to me, I want to make this point clear because it's going to follow us through the rest of our presentation. Wherever you find an authentic, good faith engagement with history, deliverance will follow. Wherever you find an authentic, good faith engagement with history, deliverance will follow. Isn't that what God did? He paid attention to history. His eternal being became a historical being. And because he became a historical being, you and I experienced the joy of salvation. Because I got news for you. If God ignored history, we'd be lost. We would be lost. Because if he ignored us, he would have never come to die for us. And so that's what I want you to keep in mind. So history is important. History matters. How many of you in this room have no history? Come on, like I tell my students, come on, raise them high. How many of you just kind of today, you just kind of like vaporized, just like showed up? Anybody in here without a birthday? Anybody in here without a past? No, that's the jurisdiction of history. It has authority over all of us. But what I love about God is that his relationship to history is so complex because it is out of his love that he remembers history to come deliver us. And it is also out of his love that once his blood is applied to our soul, our history is forgotten to save us. And so God is this extraordinary being who has placed us in extraordinary circumstances with reminders in nature that we must pay attention to history. Any doctors in here? I know, we got a nurse in here, right? We got at least one nurse in here. I think we do, right? Okay. So, you know what happens? What's the first thing you do when you go to the doctor for the first time? You have to fill out a form, right? And you have to tell the doctor your medical what? Right? Because if your history is ignored, and I'm not a doctor, but I've been around them, so I feel like I got smarter. Been around it. You've been an Adventist long enough. You've been around some doctors, okay? If the doctor ignores your history, you may have certain conditions that make medications, here's the $15 word, contraindicated, right? And if your history is ignored, you might take a medication and it could kill you. So the doctor has to know your history. What did we say? Wherever there is a good faith engagement with history, an authentic engagement with history, there will be deliverance. Now, the reverse of that is also true. Wherever there is a bad faith engagement with history, when history is twisted and distorted, and when you are, in the words of Carter G. Woodson, miseducated about history, you will not be delivered, you will remain in bondage. And so with that, I want to talk a little bit about Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech. Famous speech we'll hear quoted today. You go online, you'll see it quoted a million times. Attorney Michael Taylor did a great job this morning about the most famous passage when Douglass comes out and says, you know, your celebration is a sham, your anthem's a hollow mockery, and so forth and so on. I want to draw our attention to something Frederick Douglass said just before that most famous passage. He says to the crowd, by the way, Frederick Douglass gave this talk on July the 5th, 1852. He was invited to give the talk by the Rochester, New York Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. He told them that he refused to give the talk on July 4th because he didn't want to partake in the hypocrisy. That's the fuller context for what's happening. Well, just before he gets to the most famous passage, he says to the people, now this is a black person standing in front of, I'm sure, a lot of well-intended white people who are abolitionists. So he's standing in front of a friendly crowd, but he says to them, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, I hope you didn't call me here to argue that black people are human beings. I hope you didn't call me here to argue that slavery is wrong. And I really hope you didn't call me here to argue that slavery is not divinely ordained. Frederick Douglass said, we don't need that kind of argument today because all of those points are so obvious as to be beyond argument. So you in the car today, driving home with some family members, and all of a sudden an argument breaks out. And you know what the subject of the argument is? Whether or not 2 + 2 is really 4. You just start arguing about that, right? I mean, at some point you would look at your family and say, they're crazy, right? Because you're arguing about something that's supposed to be true already, that everybody knows is true, that is true universally, right? And Frederick Douglass said, black people are human. I'm not going to debate about that. Slavery is morally wrong. That's not a subject for debate. And a all-good, all-powerful, almighty God would not sanction chattel slavery. You're not going to get me to argue about that. Instead, what you need today, white people, he says you need your conscience stimulated. You need your sense of right and wrong brought into deeper focus. So I'm not about to stand up here and make you look at me and say, oh, what a talented Negro. Look at his argumentation ability. He said, no, I'm not going to do that, because the more time we spend doing that, the more time I become your entertainment. And the less time you spend reflecting on the institution that you've created that has put us in this condition, not only as a people, but as a nation. So he says, what you need today is not argument. No, you need my sarcasm. You need my wit. You need my rhetorical genius to get you to turn your reflection from out there and start looking in here. If I could quote Attorney Michael Taylor from this morning, you need to address the nationalism of your hearts and minds. And that's not going to happen if I am performing, thank you so much, if I'm performing intellectual gymnastics for you. So what are we talking about? We start off talking about the stars. The sun is a star. We start off talking about how those things are in the sky to remind us of the importance of history, because they all reflect the goodness of a God who entered history in order to save us. Whenever there's a good faith engagement with history, there'll be deliverance. When there's a bad faith engagement with history, people will die when we ignore history. Like if you go to the doctor, you're going to die. So we today at Mount Tahoma are not going to ignore history. So now we connect this to Frederick Douglass, and what do we see? We see Frederick Douglass essentially on the 4th of July saying to white America, you know, I'm not going to waste my time arguing about 2 + 2 being 4. We're going to spend some time on you today. And you're going to know by the end of this speech that you got to get your act together. And that's when he says, what is the slave to the 4th of July? Right? Last Tuesday, June 30th, just a few days ago, the United States Supreme Court decided Trump versus Barbara. It is a decision in which the president, through signing an executive order, attempted to eliminate birthright citizenship for people who are in this country illegally and who have children here. That decision should have been unanimous against the executive order. And what did we say a few minutes ago? How silly it would be to engage in an argument about 2 + 2 being 4. See, when people begin to argue about what is obvious, something corrupt is happening. Birthright citizenship, the Constitution, the citizenship clause of the Constitution is clear. The first 2 words are all persons. Everybody. All persons born in the United States, right? and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. If you're born here, you're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Okay? So what is really going on here? Say what you want about President Trump, and we can say a lot of things, right, about him. You know what he has succeeded in doing that's terribly dangerous? He has succeeded in making, thank you, Giselle, he has succeeded in making the obvious a matter of political debate. With the approval of 4 justices on the United States Supreme Court, the subject of birthright citizenship is no longer axiomatic. It's no longer etched in stone. Now it's up for political debate. And Justice Brett Kavanaugh, essentially, in his concurring opinion, gave a roadmap to Congress and basically told Congress, look, if you want to do away with birthright citizenship, here's how you can do it. You take the language of President Trump's executive order, you use it to amend this federal statute, and birthright citizenship is no more. The decision was 5-4. It should have been unanimous. But now, what was once thought, I mean, can you imagine waking up tomorrow and there being legitimate questions about whether or not 2 and 2 is really 4? What would that do? Like, what would that do to the world? Oh, well, we could debate that now. And this is the problem. It came up in Sabbath school. When Paul is disputing with the Greeks on Mars Hill in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, the Greeks want to argue. The Greeks want to argue about everything. They just want to argue for the sake of arguing, right? And Paul was looking at this state of affairs and thinking to himself, what are you doing? Like, what are we talking about? You know, the matters of the heart that come along with genuine religion, genuine spirituality, a deep sense of moral consciousness that's supposed to guide us in religious life, we're not really interested in that. We're really interested, and you know, we fall into this too, as Seventh-day Adventists. I was at a potluck one time. What church, I won't tell you. It's a long time ago. And the conversations that I heard during the potluck were ridiculous. The subject of one conversation was, will there be a toilet in your mansion? Because the very idea of waste material, isn't that a product of sin? I mean, what? Why does that matter? Why is it important, like, to anyone? I'm going to tell you something. I get to heaven, I ain't going to have no complaints about my mansion. And if it's a toilet in it, hey, it's all good, right? But we take the trivial and turn it into something that is overvalued. And birthright citizenship, 2 years ago, you would be laughed out of court to suggest that. But now going forward, it's the subject of debate. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, within hours of the Supreme Court decision, was holding a press conference talking about how important it's going to be for Congress to act on birthright citizenship. Now, Congress and the presidency are what we call the political branches of government, right? The Supreme Court, theoretically, is supposed to be above the fray, right? So you go to, in other words, the Supreme Court can't act on its own, right? Congress can pass legislation. And when Congress is really functional, which has been a long time, you would turn on C-SPAN and you could see committee hearings and subcommittee hearings that were not partisan sideshows, and you actually saw witnesses before these committees coming forth to talk about things. I'm going to date myself now, because I was inspired to go to law school 40 years ago, and I would turn on C-SPAN and I'd watch testimony about seatbelt laws, right? And if you really want to get a good sense of how the government works, you have to understand that the political branches, Congress and the president, can do things on their own, but the Supreme Court can't do anything until someone called a lawyer brings it to their attention. Then, you kind of wake the sleeping giant, right? Now the Supreme Court gets involved and they can declare the other two branches of government's actions unconstitutional. That's the way it's supposed to work. But what actually happens? Well, now Supreme Court has something called an emergency docket. And so you have an outrageous executive order from the president, and someone goes to court, federal court, and they say, well, Your Honor, this is unconstitutional. And the judge says, I agree. And so what we're going to do is we're going to issue an injunction, which means we're going to stop this executive order from being enforced right now, which is just going to enable us to maintain the status quo until we get to what they call the merits of the case. Well, then what ends up happening? The Trump administration appeals the injunction and asks that the injunction be stayed, that we allow the executive order to be enforced. And the other side says, well, Your Honor, we can't just fire an entire department of the federal government. That would completely upend the status quo. And then the case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court on their emergency docket says, you know what? We're going to let the executive order stay in place. And so we're going to allow the president to fire almost an entire department of the federal government. Yeah, we like that. So think of it this way. It's almost as if the court is functioning kind of like Congress. They're sort of allowing the president's agenda to get through. And by the way, cases on the emergency docket are coming up a different way than a case once there's an actual decision. Because once there's an actual decision on the case, it gets appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court gets to read it, and they have oral argument, and they ask the parties to submit briefs, and there's a full hearing before the court. But that's not happening now. So we are effectively living in a republic that is basically operating almost at 66% capacity. Or 33% capacity. Because Congress and the courts don't seem to be doing too much, but the president seems to be doing a lot by executive order. Right? So we started off talking about history and why history matters. This is my last point, and then we'll open it up if you all want to talk. In the Trump versus Barbara opinion, now remember, what did we say? Whenever there is an authentic good faith engagement with history, there will be deliverance. Wherever there is an inauthentic bad faith engagement with history, there will be oppression. So, there's two opinions in the Trump versus Barbara case I want to call your attention to. One is Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, Justice Clarence Thomas essentially, in his concurring opinion, says, look, the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment was only intended to help black people. And so the idea that an illegal immigrant could come to the United States, have a baby, and have the privilege of citizenship applied to that baby, he said, that weakens the value of my citizenship as a black person. Because I was born here, my ancestors were slaves here, and if you're not careful, I mean, I love what Attorney Taylor said earlier this morning. You know, the lies don't never come to you as lies. They come to you with a veneer of truth. You know, the serpent didn't say to Eve, hey girl, soon as you bite this, you fitting to go down. Because if he had said that to her, she wouldn't have eaten of the fruit. But you know what he said? He said, oh girl, you won't surely die. The day you eat of it, when he said you won't surely die, that was the lie. You know what the truth was? You'll be just like God. You'll know good and evil. See, because evil was something that we were never supposed to know. Yeah, exactly. We were never supposed to know evil. So, you know, you got to watch the opinion of Clarence Thomas because there's a lot of points in it that are very powerful. But ultimately, it is an inauthentic, bad faith engagement with history. And it took our sister, Ketanji. Her name means lovely one. I love it. I love Justice Jackson. She opened her concurring opinion and she said, I concur wholeheartedly in the result of this case and with its reasoning, but I write separately to express some concerns about Justice Thomas's dissenting opinion. And then she said, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, I got to memorize the first paragraph of her opinion. I'm gonna give myself that homework assignment. And next time y'all have me back up here, I'll be able to recite it word for word, right? She says, surprisingly, Justice Thomas, who consistently advocates for a colorblind Constitution, now all of a sudden wants to pay attention to the history of black people. Whew, man. And then she proceeded to give him a history lesson. So we got an in-author. What did we say? Now, when you go outside today, just take a walk in that sunshine. You are in history. God put us in history. He put all the symbols of history in nature, in the lights that he put in the heaven, the stars that he put in the heavens. They all tell us a couple of significant truths. One, if you're going to live and succeed, if you're going to shine like that star, you got to fortify yourself inside. To quote Attorney Taylor, you got to deal with the nationalism of your heart and your mind, and you got to make yourself fit to be able to withstand the pressures that are trying to collapse you, right? Not only that, you got to understand that history in nature is a reflection of the incarnate Christ, who was eternal, became historical, so he could die for us. And so Justice Jackson gives us deliverance in the form of a good faith, authentic engagement with history, because what she exposes about American history, and hence about the flawed logic of Justice Clarence Thomas, is that at the time of the 14th Amendment, the black activists who were pursuing citizenship and who were pursuing the 14th Amendment were also standing up for other people, like Chinese immigrants. There was a Chinese Immigrant Exclusion Act of 1881, right? And what Justice Jackson makes clear is that the efforts around the 14th Amendment were not efforts that were just for black people. They were efforts for other people who were also marginalized. And so I think to myself, wow, what a history lesson. And you know what? You know what's interesting? Both Justice Jackson and Justice Thomas, they both rely on Frederick Douglass for their support, right? Which goes to show you, you have to be careful because, again, the truth, a lie is never going to come to you as a lie, right? It's always going to come to you packaged in something that looks attractive. And I'm telling you, you spend enough time reading Justice Thomas's dissenting opinion, he makes a lot of good points. He's not lying, right? But the Bible tells us to do what? To test the spirits, right? To see whether they are of God. And so we started off talking about astronomy, and we ended up talking about Frederick Douglass. And in between, what we see is that honest engagements with history bring us deliverance, as with the incarnation. Dishonest engagements with history perpetuate oppression. Thank you so much. I'm blessed to be here. And I guess Pastor will open it up. Is there? Okay, we'll open it up for comments and questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent question. What do we do? I think the first thing we have to do is vote. And vote like there's no tomorrow, right? Voting is the cornerstone of our best chances, I think, come at the ballot box. In the Louisiana versus Calais decision, the Supreme Court said that there was no need for Louisiana to draw up another majority-minority district. And so what that means is that, and I'm getting to your point here in a second, the real problem with Louisiana versus Calais is that not only does it dilute black voting power, right? Because you'll hear a lot of people say, well, black people can still vote. It's not about the individual being able to vote. It's about the power, the collective power of individual members in that group to be able to elect the people who they want to represent them. So yes, you can still go to the ballot box in Louisiana and vote, but that's not the issue. So the real problem with Louisiana versus Calais is that not only does it dilute black voting power, but it says that if states want to gerrymander their districts and they do it for expressly political reasons, it's okay. In fact, in a Supreme Court decision from 2019 called Rucho versus Common Cause, that case says if a legislative district is gerrymandered and that's the only reason for the challenge, you never get to come to court. Because it's a political question, and we're not going to decide it. So the only way, Lori, to overcome obstacles like that, like one thing that would really help black people in Louisiana is if they had like 95 to 98% voter turnout in November. Then it might not matter how the district is drawn. But the problem is you're lucky if you get 18 to 20%. especially because this year is a midterm election year, and it's not a presidential election. Voter turnout tends to be much lower when it's not a presidential election. So I want to say vote. I also want to say organize. You have to do something. It's important. It's more important for black people now than ever to return to the traditions that made our communities great, right? And if you don't like what the schools are teaching in terms of black history, we could teach black history right here in the church, right? So we have to begin to understand our real political power, and we have to begin to assume responsibility for a proper historical education that will equip our community for the challenges that lay ahead. That's what I would say. Oh, yeah. Lori's follow-up, and then we'll come back to you, sir.
And I'm glad you said that, because for me it comes down to not just vote, but vote locally.
Right.
Vote in the races that you don't think matter.
Yep.
Vote in your school board, election, your city council, the mayor, whatever.
Mayor, district attorney, jury commissioner,
Sure.
all of that.
All of that, because obviously it all goes up.
Yep.
And if you're already in a district that has been redistricted or whatever, or you happen to live somewhere else that you may not see a lot of people who look like you, you may not have a lot of representation that you agree with, but those are your choices because you only vote in the district in which you live.
That's right. That's right.
I had the privilege of going to Alabama a few weeks ago with a friend who's from Selma. She was living here, but she had to go back to take care of business, and she said she had to vote while she was back at home. She said in Alabama, sometimes you have to chase the office of where you can vote. And once you even get there, she said when she was filling out her form, a white person was looking over her shoulder. See, I've worked for King County Elections, which is the main example of how every state is supposed to vote. So when I heard this, my heart just broke.
There's a gentleman in the back right there.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I would just like to say, in my family, I can understand why my grandfather, on my mother's side, Tennessee, slave, and on my mother's side, my mother was born in Canada. You see the difference. Well, I've always been confused. Now I understand, and I want to let my family know what's going on so we can all understand and just get ready for the second coming of Christ and love one another and treat each other with respect and let God do the rest.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I kind of have a question from way back when, so it has to do with things that are acts, the Voting Rights Acts, the Civil Rights Act. I understand initially maybe why they were acts, but why weren't they ever made laws? Why would they remain acts and have to be renewed every 25 years? Why would we be left hanging like that?
Okay. Well, let's go back, right? Because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were initially addressed by Congress during Reconstruction. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1875 that did the exact same thing that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, did the same exact thing that the Voting Rights Act is supposed to do. But what happened was, and I hate this, but I guess when you're a lawyer, you can talk bad about lawyers, right? The Supreme Court of the United States, in a series of decisions from 1873 in a case called the Slaughterhouse Cases, all the way up to Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal in 1896, the Supreme Court struck down every act of Congress. They said they don't apply. Justice Miller, who wrote the majority opinion in the Slaughterhouse Cases, said, you know what he said? Think of who I'm talking about when I say this. He said, oh, the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they only apply to black people. Who that sound like? Sounds like Justice Thomas, doesn't it? And guess who Justice Thomas spends a lot of time talking about in his dissenting opinion? Justice Miller. So in the Slaughterhouse Cases, what Justice Miller said is that the 14th Amendment has no application to state government. It only guarantees that the federal government won't infringe on the rights of black people, and that means that black people have to have access to federal waterways. Now, as I recall, black people during Reconstruction didn't need protection from the federal government. They needed protections from the states. But the Slaughterhouse Cases said none of these amendments applied to the states. So, and by the time you get to, and it gets worse. You know what? The Reconstruction Congress passed a law called the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1870, and they said, we coming at y'all. The Colfax Massacre happened in Louisiana. Black people showed up to vote, and over 100 black people were slaughtered. They got arrested. And when the Department of Justice went to prosecute them, they appealed their cases to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court said the Ku Klux Klan Act is unconstitutional because it imposes obligations on the states that the federal government is not permitted to do. And they all, just like the January 6, 2021 rioters, they all went free. So to put the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 in perspective, you have to know that they came just about 100 years after our Supreme Court essentially enabled a reign of terror on black people in the South. Now, your question was, well, why are they called acts and why do they have to be renewed every 25 years? Well, they're called acts. That's just a way of, I guess, just a term of art. It's just what we call it. Like, it's a bill until it becomes a law. And I think the formal name used is act because it's an act of Congress. Your other question is a more interesting one, which is, why did they have to be renewed every 25 years? Well, I think even in 1965, them white people in Congress said, all right, you want it, but we want to come back and revisit this. And President Johnson has to, Lyndon Johnson, he's, politics, he's got to say, look, man, we got to get something, right? And so, the senators and the people in Congress who voted for it, there were some concessions made. The first time the Voting Rights Act had to be renewed was during Ronald Reagan's presidency, I think. Or was it 25 years later, it was 1980. And I think Jimmy Carter, because he was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan. I think Jimmy Carter was the first one to renew it. And then after that, I think it was once every 15 years. Those are, by the way, those are called sunset provisions. So laws, they don't always last, forever. And it's interesting because if you listen to the oral arguments in Louisiana versus Calais, the redistricting case, the black woman who's the NAACP chief counsel, brilliant, she's arguing before the court, and the justices want to know, well, how long do we have to keep doing this? When is this going to end? And so that comes into the policy discussion. I think that's why things end up that way. Yeah. Okay, this brother here with a mic, and then we'll come over there. Yeah, yes, sir. Julius, right?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so based on my understanding of Michael Taylor's sermon, just what I've been hearing a lot within the church is that we're supposed to fight against Christian nationalism. So in doing that, my question is, how do we vote against sin but also vote for free will?
Well, sure. How do we vote against sin but vote for free will? Well, free will is just that. We can be free without sinning, but we can't sin unless we're free. And what I mean by that is moral condemnation for sin presupposes free will. In other words, we're not going to hold people morally accountable for things over which they have no control, right? So if I would never do this, believe me, but if I pulled out a gun right now and asked you to slap your neighbor upside her head, right? And you did it, I know your mom would not be having that, right? And you did it, as badly as everybody would feel that you did it, who's the real culprit, you or me? In other words, there's a force outside of you that compels you to act. So, but what we want and what God wants is for us to be free and always choose him. See, because that is, you do understand that's heaven, right? Heaven will be the state or condition of being free and always choosing God, because we know what choosing sin cost him the first time. Right? That's what heaven is. Heaven is doing the right thing, to quote Michelle Obama. Heaven is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. You know what heaven is? Heaven is Micah 6:8. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Heaven is unseating the idols, to quote Attorney Taylor, from the throne of your heart, right? And that is free will. So we can condemn the outcomes as evil. And I want to say, too, I think there's a difference between sin and oppression. I think the latter, oppression, is more systemic and is broader in scope, whereas sin is an individual consciously deciding to go against the will of God, if that makes sense. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, mostly,
Okay.
but quick
Okay.
follow-up.
Sure.
In terms of policies that we don't necessarily agree with, like that have to deal with rights of Americans to have the freedom to, sin and do what they want to do based on their perception. How do we vote against that because we believe it's wrong based on our ideologies and our faith? Or do we vote to give them the room to live how they want to live?
I think you have to vote to give people the room to live how they want to live. Because in the end, we are called to judge the behavior, but not the people. I am morally and spiritually incapable, believe me, I really am, of putting anyone in heaven or hell. I can't do that. We live, however, in a democracy. So let's take the obvious example here, the LGBTQ rights movement, right? The same-sex marriage movement. I can support that community's right to not be treated as second-class citizens without agreeing with how they live, right? I don't have to agree with them, but I do have to understand a very basic principle, that if I judge myself honestly, I will judge others with charity, right? If I'm honest about who I am and my own failings, right? Because here's the thing, the law, the positive law that we know, the law that comes from legislators and court decisions and executive orders, that law is not equipped to reach the human heart. Only the spiritual nature of the God we serve can penetrate there. And I have to make sure that I'm okay on the inside. Again, I keep coming back to Attorney Taylor's message this morning. What a message that was, right? I keep coming back to that because we have to be right with ourselves, right, before we go and judge others. I just want to make this point, just in case I don't want anybody, if you forget everything else I said, remember this. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 that ended Jim Crow, you know what else it did? Title VII of it grants people religious freedom in the workplace. I'm going to say that again. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended Jim Crow, gives people religious freedom in the workplace. Do you know what that means? That means that every time you need a Sabbath accommodation at work, no matter what your race or color is, you are invoking the history of black people in the United States. And yet, do you know who was one of the biggest opposers of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the protest movement that led to it? The General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And so today, if you're an Adventist, it doesn't matter what your race, ethnicity, your color, your culture, guess what you benefit from? You benefit from the rich prophetic legacy of protest in which those 4 little black girls died when they were bombed at a church on September 15th, 1963 in Birmingham. So you running around talking about, the church should stay out of politics. Okay. Don't you, listen to me. Don't you let nobody fool you about history. Why? Because wherever there's an authentic engagement with history, there will be deliverance. This church should be packed right now with every race and nationality in the Seventh-day Adventist Church to hear that basic truth about the black Americans that so many of them look down upon. This is the history. Wherever there's an authentic, good faith engagement with history, what's there going to be? There's going to be deliverance. Jesus said the truth will set you free. And it's a lot of misguided folk in this church. White, Asian, Latino, otherwise, African. Come over here and look down your nose at black people in one breath and then say, Pastor, I need a Sabbath accommodation letter. Nah, baby, you don't get to invoke that history. You don't get to invoke that history of a denomination that is now reaping where it did not sow. If you forget everything else I said today, just remember that. Remember, don't let nobody tell you nothing about history when it comes to that. I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a quick thought and a quick question. As an immigrant from the Caribbean,
yes,
like you come to the U.S. with rose-colored glasses, right?
Yes.
But seeing it, it seems like from the inception of this country to today, like there are strides and then you go backward. Not you, but, you know, because white supremacy is a thing.
That's right.
Right? And so what are your thoughts? Because I believe God created us to be free and to be happy and to have peace and to have joy in our nation. But I don't know if it's going to happen here. So what are your thoughts on repatriation or creating your own nation or your own sense of like?
Here's my thoughts. You know what I love about Jesus? When people were confused, he taught them artistically. He taught people in parables. And there's a parable in Luke 18 of the importunate widow. Y'all know that parable? He said in a certain city there was a judge, and he said he regarded neither God nor man. But he said there was a woman who went to that judge and said, "Avenge me of mine enemies." And the Bible says that she went to that judge so much that the judge essentially said, "Lord, have mercy. Let me just get this woman off my nerves." And she went ahead and the judge gave it to her. And the point of the parable was that in prayer we are supposed to have importunity. That over and over and over again, we're supposed to keep going back, that there has to be a repetition. Now, what the sister pointed to is something very real and very problematic, because it seems that racism in America is permanent. It also seems that this side of heaven, we're not going to see justice, right? The most important role I have ever played as an actor is the role of Hambone, a character in August Wilson's play, Two Trains Running. The play takes place at a diner in Pittsburgh, a diner that is condemned, and the year is 1969. And Hambone is a mentally disabled character who came up from Alabama. This is the backstory I gave the character. He was mentally disabled, and I constructed a story where he was part of the Great Migration, and in coming up from Alabama to the north to find a better life, he was separated from his family, and he ended up living by himself. And Hambone, in the story, in the script, he painted a fence for a white butcher. And he painted the fence on the condition that when he was finished, the white butcher would give him a ham. So he painted the fence, and after he painted the fence, the white butcher offered him a chicken. And Hambone, see, the diner is this place where black people gathered to vent their frustrations and their hostilities. And so Hambone would go to the diner, and my character only said two things. Every time he came in the diner, he said, "I want my ham." He gonna give me my ham. That's all he said. He didn't say anything. My character only said those two things. And he didn't talk that much, but he listened. And at the end of the play, Hambone, he died, but he never got his ham. And then one of the characters in the play went over and broke into the butcher shop and took a ham out and came in the last scene of the play. He gives the ham to the owner of the diner and says, "Here, that's for Hambone's casket." Now, you would look at Hambone and you would think everybody felt sorry for him because he didn't get his ham. But don't feel bad for Hambone, because Hambone kept trying. According to the script, Hambone went over to that butcher shop every day, 7 days a week, even on the Sabbath, for 9 years. And every time he got denied his ham, he came into the diner and said, I want my ham. He gonna give me my ham. Black people want the ham of justice. Instead, we're being offered the chicken of white supremacy. Black people want the ham of quality community policing. Instead, we're getting the chicken of police brutality and murders of unarmed black people. And so, like the importunate widow, we have to be like her and Hambone. The victory is not in actually getting what you want. The victory is in having the fortitude to never stop demanding it. And it's not just getting what you want. Hambone wasn't asking for a handout. Hambone only wanted what he negotiated and what he was due. He wasn't sitting on the sofa, drinking beer, playing video games. He worked. And so that's what we have to have, that spirit. I call it the spirit of Hambone, the spirit of the widow, the spirit of repetition, of coming back over and over and over again. I just published an essay where I said that for black people have an eschatology of importunity, which means that the ultimate end of black people will always be in a position of demanding what they're rightfully due. And we might not get it here, but one day I think God is going to make it right. Yes, ma'am. And there's a lady in the back, too. We'll have to come to you, yeah.
Okay, this is my own personal commentary.
Uh-huh.
I just say I detest the use of supremacy after the word white. Like, why have we adopted what they call themselves? Why don't we just call it racism? White racism every time that phrase needs to get used.
Well, I can understand how you might feel that way, but it's not about us giving them credit for what they call themselves. It's about us saying that what you call yourself is wrong. That's the way I've always thought about it. Yes, ma'am. In the red, in the back.
Just regarding with the immigrants.
Yes.
And the refugees. I've noticed the difference here in the state of Washington of how immigrants are treated differently for our supportive services and perks and housing, education, and all of that. I'm not sure if it's prevalent across the United States of how the difference in immigrants based on their culture, race, how they're treated. I don't know if there's any like higher up in government more discrimination against, or what we could do, what can we do on a local level. I work with the immigrants and refugees. I've seen Russians get more than the other. I've seen the Afghanistans get more. I've seen Ukrainians get more than somebody who speaks Spanish or
somebody from Haiti, French, or
Asian.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things we have to do as a church is plug into and join with organizations who are already doing the work. And by that, I don't mean giving people Bible studies and inviting them to church. We got to stop that, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't do evangelism, but there's a time and a place for everything. And I think the time and the place for joining in to do the kind of work that you're doing is figuring out who in the community is doing that type of work and going there and saying, how can I help? I think that's good. If the church could, I guess, if there was a department that was ambitious enough, if you had enough of a critical mass of people who here at the church who wanted to do something, immigrant communities are part of our families, right? What's the family life department doing to help alleviate some of this burden, right? In other words, there's ways for the church to do it, but I also think the church needs to be conscious of, and individuals need to be conscious of, who's actually already doing the work, and then joining on board with them, understanding that you're not necessarily there to convert people, but you're there to help out with the work. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I could say is that you try to make an appeal to maybe join with other local churches or try to do something of that nature, but I don't really have a full-on solution to that. So I'm sorry. I wish I had more to say. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess Michael's up now? You up now? Okay. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. Dr. Golden is a professor I wish I've had when I was in college or law school. I always enjoy listening to the depth of wisdom and knowledge he brings to the table. Thank you so much for that enlightening and timely presentation. The presentation I'm going to go, I don't know if is my computer connected to the system yet? Let me. I'm presenting on democracy. There's been a lot of talk about. Okay, while we're trying to figure this out, there's been a lot of talk about democracy going through an era of indigestion. The United Kingdom has had 7 prime ministers in the last 10 years. And when you look at countries around the world, you look at France. Emmanuel Macron, the current prime minister, who's in his, I guess we would call him a lame duck here in America. He has found it increasingly difficult to call for, He has found it incredibly difficult to call for new elections because he can't build a coalition. Same in Germany. They can't build a coalition. When you look around the world, you see Israel between the years 2019 and 2022. Israel held 5 national elections because no coalition could maintain a governing majority. The resulting instability has sparked debate about electoral reform and judicial independence. South Korea has experienced repeated presidential scandals, impeachments, deep political polarization. You look at Brazil. Brazil had their own January 6th moment, and it was on January the 8th, 2022, where folks stormed their parliamentary government because they didn't like the outcome of their election. So this is not a uniquely American issue. The entire world, it seems, is going through a fever, an anti-democratic fever. Hungary has Viktor Orban, who recently lost his election, but our own vice president was sent over there to campaign for him. The current president boasted that he had Viktor Orban's endorsement, someone who is an authoritarian, someone who abuses his people, who manipulates the kinds of news that his people are able to receive. This is not a normal time on Earth's history. And as we're getting ready to show the slide, it's amazing that the 250th year, the semi-quincentennial, falls this year. There are people who are saying, well, I don't feel like, I really don't feel like celebrating the 4th of July this year. I feel like it's not well-deserved. I feel like this 250th year comes at a terrible time. May I suggest to you that every time we've had a major anniversary, it's always been during a time when democracy itself seems to be unraveling? Rewind back to 1826. The country is 50 years old. There's a presidential election going on between the son of former President John Adams. This man can speak 8 languages. In his youth, he used to be going to overseas with his father to France and to England as a diplomat. He later then served as a diplomat under the administration of Thomas Jefferson. If there was ever an intellectual that ascended to the presidency, it was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is going against someone who is a ruffian, a frontiersman, someone who was born in the hills of Tennessee, didn't know his own father. His father died before he was born. There were rumors about him having black blood, which was scandalous at the time. He had a hot temper. He actually used to engage in what we call duels, where if they had a dispute, 2 men would go outside, and the way they would determine who is the winner of this dispute is whoever comes out of this situation alive, because they would shoot pistols at one another. Someone insulted his wife at one time. Rachel Donaldson was her name, because they said that their union was illegitimate, being that she was already married. It was actually true, by the way. He actually courted another man's wife. He got offended, killed the man. After he was shot in the chest, took the bullet and shot. So the election comes down to between these 2 people. It's the first of its kind to have tabloid, scandalous kinds of rumors floating around on both sides. People feel as if the American experiment itself is falling apart. For the first time, the vote is not just restricted to white men who are landowners, but white rural men who don't have much can now actually cast a ballot. We don't have the full union like we know today. But what's interesting about this election is that in the Constitution, do you know what happens if there's a tie? What happens on election night if there's no clear winner between the 2 contenders for the presidency, or however many contenders for the presidency? Who determines who's the president? The House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, the Constitution says, will vote by delegation, meaning that all of the senators and congressmen from one state will cast their electoral votes for a particular candidate. What happens is John Quincy Adams, with the help of Henry Clay, who himself has presidential ambitions, Speaker of the House, and future nemesis to Martin Van Buren, he's going to run in 1836. They decide to go behind the closed doors and promise things, and Andrew Jackson ends up losing that election, even though he wins the popular vote. He calls this election a corrupt bargain. He goes around saying the election was rigged. Where have we heard this before? A lot of times we think we're seeing these things for the first time. But I refer you to Ecclesiastes, where it says, nothing new is under the sun. The nation is 50 years old, and already there's questions about election integrity. Fast forward 50 more, John Quincy Adams wins that election. 4 years later, Andrew Jackson wins. And if you thought January 6th was bad, because he was the man of the people, or the common man's president, after he's sworn in, there's such a frenzy that people storm the White House and take whatever they can find. It's a chaotic scene. Men are trampling upon children. People are trampling upon the weak. It's chaotic. Fast forward 100 years, we're in 1876. 1876 is interesting for many years, for many reasons, because it's the death knell of Reconstruction. Think about what was going on between the year Abraham Lincoln died in 1865 and 1876. You have the 13th Amendment, prohibition against slavery. The 14th Amendment, which contains the Equal Protection Clause, as applicable to the federal government. And then you have the 15th Amendment, right to vote, which expands the vote to black men. These 3 amendments are the cornerstone of modern democracy. And if you notice, there are right now efforts to do away with the 14th Amendment, and it's not going to stop there. The 15th and the 13th will be their targets next. But it's in this environment where you have a presidential election again. You have a Republican former congressman from Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. He's a Presbyterian. His wife is a staunch believer in her religion, so much so that they call her Lemonade Lucy. No alcohol in her presence, right? Then you have a man named Samuel Tilden from New York. Samuel Tilden's a Democrat. These two men are battling it out, and back then, the inauguration was in March, not in January. So between November of 1876 and January of 1877, you have a disputed election that comes down to 4 states. I believe it's Florida, South Carolina, I want to say Mississippi, but I can't remember the other one, but it comes down to 4 states. And they come up with a commission. 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 independents come together and behind closed doors, and they say, well, let's come to an agreement. If you get rid of those pesky Union soldiers protecting black people in the South, who just got their rights, we will give the Republican Party the White House. Rutherford B. Hayes says, that sounds good to me. And that's how we get the 19th president of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. Reconstruction is over. There are accounts of people in the antebellum South throwing parties, mixing lemonade and whiskey, as the last ships of the Union Army are leaving South Carolina, leaving Georgia, leaving North Carolina. They are celebrating because they know now it's open season. And there's a new era now about to unfold where we see more mass lynchings. This is the era where you get Ida B. Wells coming to the scene. And if you don't know Ida B. Wells is a black female journalist who, in fact, there was a target on her back because what she would do is pull the rug from under all of these news articles that would give reports of black brutes going after white innocent women. And she would say, no, actually, she came on to him. Or that wasn't the situation. She would add more flesh and more details, discrediting the whole argument that white America was perpetuating about these newly slaved black men. And so that's 1876, folks. 1926, 150 years. A year prior, the Ku Klux Klan has the largest parade in broad daylight right down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. People pitch tents days in advance just to be able to attend this event. You have a situation where Calvin Coolidge makes a statement, America is for Americans. This legislation that he signs, immigration, to restrict who can become an American citizen. You have Bloody Sunday of 1925, where there's a dispute that erupts into hundreds of blacks being killed. Fast forward to 1976. The country is reeling from Watergate. People are becoming more cynical about their government. And it's in that situation where you have a governor from a former Confederate state who surprised many. He's featured in Time magazine because of his famous statement, the era of segregation is over. That governor is Jimmy Carter. He gets the endorsement of Martin Luther King Sr. And what's amazing about 1976, as the country is celebrating 200 years, is that not only are we dealing with a situation where people are having mistrust in government, we're also dealing in a situation where they're purposely putting out videos on the news of people that they label super predators, people who are engaged in drugs and violence, and there are images of black men being rotated on the TV screens. And in fact, if you don't believe this was intentional, look at Lee Atwater's, who was an advisor to both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Lee Atwater said, do you think that was by coincidence that we tried to put these images out there? Of course we knew what we were doing. It was by design. So here we are in 2026, 50 years later. And there are many who are like, well, this doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like the right time to celebrate. Well, when was the right time to celebrate? American history will reveal many things if you're paying attention. In 2022, there was a meeting. There's a meeting between Carter-era folks. There's a gentleman I know personally who was the former deputy chief of staff for President Carter. My mentor, Preston Foster, is his mentee. And he was a part of this meeting along, if you are familiar with Dick Gephardt, former House Majority Leader. He also ran for president in 2004. And other folks from the 2000s, the 80s, the 90s, who met in 2022. And they came to a shocking revelation. They said most democracies have a lifespan of about 300 years. And then they disintegrate. You had Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. She was in this meeting. They said it's time to ring the alarm bells, and it's time to say to people, hey, wake up. There's nothing written that democracy always has to exist, Gephardt told him. In fact, most writers on democracy say that the average life of a democracy in history is about 300 years. What's amazing is that people are becoming less and less disturbed by that. Look at this. Less than 4% of Democratic ad spending mentioned January 6th. There was a strategic disconnect. Protect democracy by winning elections versus persuade voters that democracy itself was on the ballot. Only 11% ranked democracy as a top concern for them. This is telling. It's showing that people are becoming numb to things that, say, 20 years ago, we would never even conceive of. I like to take a step back and look at things from a historical perspective, if you haven't noticed. And so let's look at the Bible and see, well, where do we get democracy? A lot of people like to start with Athens and Greece. I think we need to take back a step even further. God invites his people into a covenant of shared responsibility in the book of Exodus chapter 19. Moses told the people, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then what? Out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. That's Exodus 19 verse 5. This event was marked by thunder, by lightning. God's law was given as a foundation for a community governance. In other words, we now have a social contract. The interesting thing about a social contract is that it needs everyone to consent to it. You need the governed as well as the governors to consent to the social contract. The covenant seed reflects democracy's core. The early church in Acts chose leaders, and I believe there was an influence from Moses. Remember Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, said, you can't lead these people by yourself. What did he suggest? He suggested dividing, right, the large amount of people by groups and sects, and having people he can trust serve as basically governors of those people. Doesn't that sound like a republic? Where you have you have representatives who act on your own behalf, make decisions on your behalf, and they convene in a council, right? And of course, there's someone who's an executive over them. And so the early church in Acts chose leaders. They chose deacons to serve community, continuing this governance model. I'm going to race through this presentation. So the roots of democracy could be traced back to the governing model God gave Israel. In Exodus 18, Jethro advised Moses to share leadership. Deuteronomy 1:13, Moses instructed, choose wise, understanding, and respected men from each of your tribes. We move on to the 5th century BC. Athens, the birthplace of direct democracy, as many people like to call it. Citizens voted directly on laws. And then you have Rome, right? All of a sudden, you have a system of checks and balances. Two co-equal branches that counterbalance each other out in terms of their powers and responsibilities. These ideas created enduring legacies of representative government and rule of law that inspired later civilizations like the United States of America. You have certain humanistic views coming into play with democracy. You have Montesquieu, who is credited with being the originator of the separation of powers, right? You have people like John Locke, right? Thomas Jefferson was a student of John Locke. John Locke said that there are three essential factors that determine whether you have a truly representative government. Life, liberty, and not the pursuit of happiness, but property. When you look at the Constitution, you realize there's a huge emphasis on property rights. Property was essential to the pursuit of happiness in the founders' belief. The idea that you can be your own lord over your own fief, right? You have the idea of a social contract. So all of these things, I'm just pulling the page back to show you. In fact, this is not on the slide. Thomas Paine, who's heard of Thomas Paine? The author of Common Sense. Thomas Paine pulls inspiration from a lot of these philosophers in his argument to break ties with Great Britain in the run-up to the revolution in 1776. What's interesting is that if you read the Great Controversy, Ellen White very rarely tells you who is going to be lost. She says Thomas Paine will be in hell. It's chilling, but it's true. She said that. And she says that because of the rebellious spirit that were behind his writings was like wildfire. You know, in American history class, they just make it seem like people were just intellectually stimulated. This was catching fire because there was a spirit of rebellion that resonated with these white colonists. And the irony is, while he's talking of freedom, we understand that since 1619, there are auction blocks, there are people being separated from their children, people are being treated like animals, and all of this is happening as these people are gathering in the squelching summer of 1775 and 1776. Long before the American Revolution, John Adams called on Americans to investigate how government worked. Let us search into the spirit of the British Constitution. Read the histories of ancient ages. Complete the great examples of Greece and Rome. Do you see where they're pulling their inspiration from as they're deciding what kind of government this is going to be? So, of course, we have the delegates of the Constitutional Convention following this advice. They create a republic. Oftentimes we say, we're a democracy. We are a democratic republic. That's what we are. We vote for a congressman. We vote for senators, and they make decisions up and down the ballot on our behalf. And another thing is that we're not a direct democracy because there's another thing called the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the result of a compromise. Who's heard of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan? The Virginia Plan, of course, was inspired by a representative for Virginia who said, no, the larger states should have more representation. The New Jersey Plan, of course, says the opposite. No, the smaller states should have more or equal representation. So they said, okay, well, we're going to have two equal branches. We're going to have a House that's based on population. And then we'll have a Senate that's just based on 2 senators per state. And this is how we get the House and the Senate as we know it. What's interesting is that even when you look at the Middle Ages, you have a document coming on the scene in 1215 called the Magna Carta. For the first time, you have a monarch consenting to not be above the law. You have King John agreeing not to raise taxes without first consulting the great council of nobles and church officials. So we see all of these are, and then of course the Mayflower Compact comes as a result in 1620, right? And they're pulling the ideas they got from the old world and into this new environment, and they're trying to come up with a self-government document where each of the 13 colonies writes a charter granted by the monarch at the time and the parliament. I'm just speeding through this. Of course, Ellen White says, God's hand, as the framers were gathering in the squelching summer of 1776, God's hand guided the framing of the Constitution. The Constitution was designed to protect the rights of all, to permit no kingly power, but to recognize the equality of men before the law. What's amazing is, for all the flaws of America and all the flaws of the Constitution, God is still involved in the process. We hear people say, oh, the brilliance of Thomas Jefferson and the astounding mind of James Madison, the father of the Constitution. God's hand was in this. Because think about it, if this was left solely to the discretion of man, would we even have room to create a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment? Would we have room for the abolishment of slavery? We wouldn't have room for any of these things. So the founders, they fear mob rule. They designed the Electoral College as a buffer. There's a notion that, we can't just let everybody just vote. What's going to happen if they elect someone that's a tyrant? What's going to happen if they decide to revolt? So they put this in place. More importantly, what happens if their population size includes African Americans? The states that were largely plantation states wanted their states to be considered as men all of a sudden. They come up to, of course, the 3/5 compromise. And it's amazing that every time there's a compromise, whether it's the compromise of the 3/5 compromise or the compromise of 1855 or 56, do you notice that blacks are always in the center of this compromise? Always in the centerpiece of almost every compromise, if you notice. Fast forward 1850, America's democracy is teetering on the edge. Okay, we're getting closer and closer to the Civil War. A man named Millard Fillmore is in office. Millard Fillmore was someone who was a common man. He didn't have a formal education. In fact, he wasn't even expecting to be president. He's only president because Zachary Taylor dies in 1850 after consuming milk and berries. And there's debate about was it food poisoning or was there other factors that caused his death? Regardless, he's dead. Millard Fillmore now ascends to the presidency, and he signs what's called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. If you've ever seen the movie of Harriet Tubman that came out a few years ago, there's a scene in that movie where there's an announcement being made in the North that President Fillmore has just signed the Fugitive Slave Act. And it's almost as if there's a cold shutter that goes over everyone because it's like open season, everyone for themselves. Because that law says anyone from the South, any white person can come and take a black person, free or slave, capture them and ship them back down and get a fee of $1,000+, which back in 1850 is a lot of money. So, it's interesting. Ellen White warns the church during this time. She says, any follower of Christ is not to obey that law. A lot of times we think of civil disobedience as something we're going to be required to do down the road. Now, there's going to be a time when we have to stand up for our beliefs in the future. She was telling them right then and there, 1850, do not obey this law. And if you obey this law, you can't consider yourself part of the body of Christ. In 1861, she says, slavery, the accursed thing, was weakening the nation. Men were choosing darkness rather than light. So look at these compromises. The Missouri Compromise 1820, balancing, this is whether, are we going to have slavery in the new freed state of Kansas and Missouri? Are we going to have slavery? In 1850, there's an attempt to balance the deepened divisions, right? You also have in 1857 the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, if you know the story, was a slave whose master had recently passed. He's now looking to declare himself free, being that his master is no longer around. His case goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, first of all, your property, you don't even have standing. And so that decision is meaningful for many reasons. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is important because for the first time, blacks are able to sit on juries. Blacks are able to enter into contracts. Things that they couldn't do before because of this decision. They were considered property. Do you see the power of the Supreme Court? A lot of times people say, we're the three co-equal branches. I will suggest to you they're not co-equal. The Supreme Court is the most dominant branch, in my view, because they're the final arbiter of what the Constitution means. So this deepened division. You had opposing principles of liberty and equality. You had President, what's his name? Fillmore, Buchanan. James Buchanan says, well, I'm just going to let whatever the Supreme Court decides, I'm just going to abide by it. And he thought for somehow that's not going to split the nation in two. James Buchanan, the perfect way to describe his presidency by the time you get to 1860, it's almost like the house is on fire and he's ready to jump out. In fact, in the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, he says, if you're as happy to enter the presidency as I am to leave it, then you must be a very happy man. In 1860, there's 4 candidates running for office. Stephen Douglas, someone who is very staunchly for slavery. You have Abraham Lincoln, whose position is, I'm not against slavery, but I'm also not against the division of the Union as well. He's more focused on the keeping the Union together. And then you have 2 more candidates. Of course, they lose. Abraham Lincoln wins. And do you know, people say, oh, we've never been this divided. We've never had this much political uncertainty. Don't believe that. Abraham Lincoln had to come in disguise in a train and sneak into Washington, D.C. just to be inaugurated. Because there was an assassination attempt. There's a secret organization called the Pinkerton Crew that was hired to snuff out these secret assassins who were trying to kill Lincoln before he took office. The election of Abraham Lincoln is so electric that South Carolina, the state that Ellen White says God's wrath was over the most, says, you know what, we're out. We're going to secede from the Union altogether. We can't take an Abraham Lincoln as president. We're gone. They're the first state to leave the Union, 1861. In January 1861, Ellen White had a vision in Parkville, Michigan, and she revealed a terrible war was coming to the nation. She saw the war as God's judgment on God's judgment on the nation for the sin of slavery, affecting both the South for participating in it and the North for tolerating. Do you know that the North had banks, Bank of America, and other banks that were profiting off the slave trade? We think they all know this, just the South. The North was glory land. Everyone could just, both sides were being condemned. But what's interesting is that the South bore the brunt of the wrath. When you look at her quote, she said, I'm going to quote her directly. She said, God's judgment upon the sin of slavery. Oh, hold on. Hold on. Excuse me. She was basically saying that the South actually, okay, so God is not with the South. This is the Testimonies from the Church, Volume 1, page 359. God is not with the South, and he will punish them dreadfully in the end. Okay, so there are spiritual forces working behind the scenes during this civil war. In fact, she tells anyone, if you have any, people say, oh, keep politics out the church, keep politics. She said, if you have any sympathies for this Confederate side, you have no place behind the pulpit. How many of us would say she's too political today? You have no place in God's church if you are in a line. She actually makes the direct correlation between the Confederacy and the Confederacy that took place in heaven. The same spirit. A spirit of rebellion. A spirit of supremacy. When the Civil War began, each side was convinced that its cause was just. Southerners believed they had the right to leave the Union. In fact, they called the conflict the War for Southern Independence. In their mind, this is their Revolutionary War. Southerners wanted independence so that they could keep their traditional way of life, including the institution of slavery. Oh, let me go back. She says, Testimonies, Volume 1, page 264, the law of God was trampled in the dust. For this, the nation was to be humbled. Democracy survived, but look at the cost. 600,000 are dead. Do you know that she says that all of the great countries of the world, because the United States was not a superpower yet, France, United Kingdom, Germany, Belgium, Austria, all of these grand countries with rich histories are looking at this experiment with awe at the edge of their seat to see what is about to happen. So I'm going to skip. That was just a map to show you the pattern in which each of the states decide to leave one by one. South Carolina is first in 1861. So this is a conversation I had on my platform with Representative Jim Clyburn, who represents the 6th Congressional District of South Carolina. Representative Clyburn is going to shed some light about what happened after the Battle of Appomattox. Let me see if I could play this. Let me play it from.
I'm hopeful that we can turn this around. I'm hopeful that the courts will step in to preserve this democracy, but I'm not sure. Because the last time the country was here, and the country was in this place before, I'm amused when I hear people say all the time, it's never been like this before. Yes, it was. You just wasn't here. Back in 1876, when the election was thrown into the House of Representatives and the great betrayal took place that we call the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. You just wasn't here, but it took place. You wasn't here when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president and gave pardons to all of those Confederates, just like the president just gave pardons to all those insurrectionists. Yeah, we've been here before. I can walk you through this history that you don't have time for today, and I can let people know that everything they're seeing today did happen before.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I always say I believe the spirit of the MAGA movement, the rebellious spirit willing to overtake the government, is the very descendant of the Confederate spirit. In fact, during the Civil War, the Confederate flag didn't even get into the Capitol Hall the way it did on January the 6th.
Absolutely, never did. Never did. And, you know, your listeners and viewers, I don't know exactly how this thing goes out to people, but they might be interested in knowing what we call a Confederate battle flag was never adopted. What we call it the Confederate flag, it is a battle flag they use on the battlefield, but that was never the Confederate flag. That people were so embarrassed by all that. Even Robert E. Lee, when he surrendered at Appomattox, he said to the people of the South, furl your flags and put them in the attic. You know, it's just these insurrectionists went up into the attic and grabbed that flag and brought it out here into the Capitol. So you're so right, and I'm glad you put it that way. I don't know whether the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, but they all flow from the Confederates. That's all MAGA is, the same Confederate spirit.
And so what's interesting is that you notice you see Confederate flags branded on the back of trucks. Well, if you go to the South, I don't know, this is my first time in Washington. But if you go to the South where I'm from, the Confederate flag is there. Every time I cross state lines, I'm going to Florida next week, there's a giant Confederate flag waving as big and bold as can be. In South Carolina, where the conference headquarters of where I am, the South Atlantic Conference, right before you get to the conference, there's a big Confederate flag to greet you on the highway. There's a Confederate flag when I go back to my hometown in North Carolina. There's a Confederate flag every time you cross state lines. And it's not even a matter of, notice, we never see the Nazi flag out like that. But they represent the same thing. They both represent white supremacy. They represent a system that's antagonistic to the system of God. Amen? And so he's saying, basically, there was to be no pride in the flag at all. In fact, branding the flag was supposed to be an act of shame. Furl it up, he said, and put it in your attic, never to be seen again. And so I talked about this before. She says the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. The Lord has made manifest that he has no sympathy with slavery. This is not a situation where it's like, well, depending on where you are on the side of the aisle, I can understand. No, there is no tolerance for slavery, period. And if you oppose that, then you have you're not in alignment with what God is looking, with God's thoughts on the matter. We went over the 1876 compromise. Notice that picture at the bottom. What do you see if you look at that picture closely? You see, if you're looking, a black family gathered together, and there's someone with a crude mask over their head. That's the origin of Daniel Bedford Forrest's Ku Klux Klan that was established in the state of Tennessee. That's symbolic of what was going on in that time. Black men were taken out in front of their families, tied to tree stumps and whipped brutally for the act of voting, for having the nerve to run for Congress, for the state representative and for Congress. This was a brutal time in American history. We talked about immigration throughout the day. This has been a rich day, has it not? We've talked a little bit about immigration policies, right? What's interesting is immigration debates are not new. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were on opposite sides of this issue. You had the Federalists, like Adams, like Alexander Hamilton, who's on your $10 bill, and then you had the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong central government, and they did not want immigrants coming in. And at the time, the immigrants they didn't want coming in were French immigrants, because the French would come in and sympathize with the Anti-Federalists, vote in elections, and allow them to win. So you see how there's nothing new under the sun. You had the Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. They wanted states' rights. They wanted greater trust in the people. They wanted openness to immigrants. And so you have, in 1798, when John Adams is president, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which passed by a Federalist-controlled government. What it does is it extends the naturalization process. Okay, you want to be a citizen? Instead of it taking you 7 years, we're going to extend that process to 14 years. We're also going to allow the president to detain or deport non-citizens deemed dangerous. That violates, of course, habeas corpus, right? Or I'm sorry, that sounds like habeas corpus. Critics argued these laws violated democratic freedoms. Fast forward to the 19th century, the 1800s. The open immigration fueled growth. You had the Irish coming in, the Germans coming in. The grandfather of Donald Trump comes in this wave of immigration in the 1870s. You have the Chinese who worked on the railroads in the West. They are coming in and influencing America's West Coast. Then you fast forward to, then you have what they call the Know Nothing Party, who decides their position is to be anti-immigrant. And then it leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that Dr. Golden was talking about, that we were referencing all throughout the day. Fast forward to the 20th century. You have Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924, restricting immigration, favoring Northern Europeans. 1965, right? Immigration and Nationality Act. It abolished quotas. It reshaped democracy through new diversity. You have a lot of people from the West Indies that can trace their lineage coming to America from the 1965 Nationalization Act. This law opened up the floodgates to a lot more people to become Americans. And then you have the modern debate. Immigrants remain central to democracy. Who belongs, who votes, and who defines we the people. Exodus 22 verse 21 says, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you are" what? Strangers in the land of Egypt. We have Jim Crow. We talked about that. I'm just racing through this. The progressive era votes. Women couldn't vote until the 19th Amendment was. The 19th Amendment was passed. What's amazing is we think that people being sympathetic to Nazi ideology is something of social media. We think that's something new. Do you know that there was a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden in the year 1939? Do you know that these folks had a big, strong, tall image of George Washington that they were saluting? 20,000 people attended this pro-American rally sponsored by the German-American Bund at Madison Square Garden. George Washington's portrait was flanked by American flags and swastikas. Attendees wore Nazi armbands. They sang the Star-Spangled Banner. They carried posters like "Stop Jewish Domination of Christian America." And this is a quote from one of the Bund leaders. "It has always been distinctly American to safeguard the Aryan character of this nation." Nothing new under the sun. You had this guy, Isidore Greenbaum, a Jewish New Yorker, disrupted he was a rabble rouser. He decided to disrupt this rally. And they beat him. And as they beat him, they were cheering. He was rescued by police. He was fined for disorderly conduct. And he said, "I would have done it again." And he later joined the U.S. Navy to fight in World War II. So fast forward Fast forward to the 1940s, 1950s. You have a realignment. We talked about the Great Migration a little bit just now, where folks are moving up north to Chicago and to New York, to Boston. You have a realignment of black political allegiance in this time period. Remember, Abraham Lincoln's party is still seen as the party of civil rights still, even though there have been large concessions being left behind in the 1920s, right? In the 1876 Compromise. They've been letting go of their civil rights roots more and more and more. And now here we are in 1948, and you have a Democrat. In fact, when Roosevelt dies in 1945, April 12th, it was such a shock that people said, what was the nation? Who was this man? Who was this ignoramus Truman from Missouri? Roosevelt was a giant who could stand with Stalin and Churchill. And now we've got, they thought Truman was a little pick-me from a southern town. How is he going to represent America? Well, Truman surprises a lot of people. He desegregated the armed forces. He supported civil rights. He alienated Southern Democrats. And this is where you get the Dixiecrat Party. A man by the name of Strom Thurmond, who's ever heard of him? Strom Thurmond decides, you know what, I'm going to leave this party, and I'm running for president myself, based on what they call states' rights. But notice how every time states' rights is evoked, it's always under the banner of anti-civil rights. So Truman runs for president in 1948 for re-election. They're counting him out so much that in advance, they say, Dewey, the Republican, defeats Truman. It's over. There's no use. Just pack your bags. You don't have to stay up late, turn off the TV, get some rest. You already know the conclusion. And Truman ends up winning. So there's a picture of Truman holding up the newspaper. Dewey defeats Truman defiantly. But do you know Strom Thurmond goes on to serve in the Senate until 2003? Strom Thurmond, if you go back and watch the inauguration of George W. Bush, he's in the room where George W. Bush is making his first executive orders as president in 2001. Strom Thurmond, they found out, had a secret child who was a black woman, ironically. But it's amazing. History is amazing. You have the civil rights era, of course. And what's going on in the 1960 election, you know the letter from a Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King is in jail, and you have Sergeant Stryver, the brother-in-law of John F. Kennedy, going to Bobby Kennedy, imploring him to make a call to Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife. Bobby Kennedy is vehemently against that plan. Joe Kennedy already said, I don't even want Sammy Davis Jr. making appearances for the campaign, because every time we lose a precinct in Alabama. And because Sammy Davis Jr. was married to a white woman. And this is 1960. Anyway, Sergeant Stryver goes behind Bobby's back, goes to Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy makes the phone call, and Robert is so mad he grabs Sergeant Stryver and slams him against the wall. But it's in that moment where they realize this was actually a plus for the campaign. Because Martin Luther King Sr., who had endorsed Richard Nixon, now announces his endorsement for John F. Kennedy, and the congregation goes with Martin Luther King Sr., and now they're supporting the Democratic nominee for president. John F. Kennedy wins that election. And in the campaign, he said, I will sign civil rights legislation with the stroke of a pen. But 1961 comes and goes, 1962. And so the civil rights leaders are saying, well, maybe he doesn't have a pen, so let's send him some pens. So they start mailing the White House pens, because apparently President Kennedy can't find, yes, go ahead, sir. President Kennedy needs a pen. Go ahead.
Nothing to be proud of, but I was a first aid attendant in the ambulance when Bobby Kennedy died. My family probably don't remember, but it's always hit me, and it's bad history.
That's incredible. And so it just goes to show you this is not that far away. A lot of times we think of history as just far removed. It's a storybook. We're in a different world today. People are still alive from that time.
This would be an interesting exercise to do. I'll give it away. But if you go to Google and you ask the question, when did Mississippi ratify the 13th Amendment? The date that you're going to see is February 7th, 2013. No, I'm not kidding. Yes.
So, looking at history gives you an insight as to, you ever heard people, oh, I can't believe we're still dealing with so-and-so in 2026. I can't stand when people say that. Because it's almost to assume that because it's 2026, these things just magically, poof, went away. But if laws have not been changed, if policies have not changed, if attitudes and agendas are still in place as they were in this time period, then what would 2026 truly change? 1964 comes, and I want you to pay attention. 1964 comes, because we know John F. Kennedy dies November 23rd, 1963. He's assassinated. And now we have a Southerner from Texas becoming president. So you have people like Richard Russell saying, okay, we got one of our good old boys in the White House. This is amazing. Lyndon Johnson is now president. And what's amazing about 1964 is that you have a senator in Arizona named Barry Goldwater who writes the book, The Conscience of a Conservative. You ever heard of that book before? The Conscience of a Conservative is basically his political manifesto in response to Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Voting Rights Act. He's vehemently against that law. He thinks that his argument is the federal government has no place telling private entities like diners what to do, what patrons to serve. He's vehemently against it. The Cow Palace in California, I think it's Los Angeles. Los Angeles is where the Republican convention is being held in 1964. Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, former baseball player, he's a Republican delegate. He says the atmosphere at this Republican convention was comparable to Hitler's Germany because they chased out all of the black delegates in 1964 in the Republican National Convention. This is important. A lot of people say, oh, and I've heard celebrities, Nick Cannon, oh, well, people don't know Republicans freed the slaves. But apparently he fell asleep in history class after that because there was much more that happened that when people come up with these simple Simon arguments, you have to know what you're talking about, folks. And it's for a sense of identity as well. They chased Belva Davis, who was a black journalist. They chased her out. There was violence against the black delegation. So naturally, who do you think they went to? They found a home with the Democratic Party. Now, this generation, this is when young people say, oh, we're not our ancestors. The response to that is, you're not your ancestors. Because your ancestors knew the power of persistency, right? Not voting was not an option for these people. And so they say, well, we're going to put our weight behind Johnson, re-elect Johnson. Johnson wins in the biggest landslide up to that date. Johnson, of course, goes on to sign the third civil rights legislation, this Housing Bill of 68, in the middle of the Watts riots, Black Panthers coming onto the scene and everything like that. But it's important to know our history because people think, oh, no, they oversimplify history. And when you oversimplify things, it's easy to allow absurd arguments. Like you were mentioning, Donald Trump is making the most obvious debatable. You can do that by making things simple, by forgetting history, by rewriting narratives. 1964 comes and goes. Let's see. King said, and mind you, Martin Luther King was not trying to be political. He said, I have no choice but to endorse a candidate in this election. He said, I had no alternative but to urge every Negro and white person of goodwill to vote against Mr. Goldwater. That's Jackie Robinson at the convention. Let me just skip this. Of course, we get the 64 election. Now Nixon's coming on the scene, 68. Of course, he's promising a return to normalcy, which is a wink, wink, nod, nod. Let's go back to the days when, we put some brakes on all of this progress. So look at the Supreme Court rulings since 1876. United States versus Reese. What did that do? And we're talking about in the realm of voting rights now. It narrowed enforcement of the 15th Amendment, weakening protections against racial disenfranchisement, which is why you can get things like grandfather clauses. Well, if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. But if you can't, well, I don't know what to tell you. I can't help. Those kinds of barriers are possible because of this amendment. Then you fast forward to 1915. Gwynn versus United States struck down Oklahoma's grandfather clause as unconstitutional race discrimination. Then in 1966, South Carolina versus Katzenbach. It upheld the Voting Rights Act preclearance as constitutional under the 15th Amendment. Harper versus Virginia ruled poll taxes unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Shelby County versus Holder, this is a key decision. What does that do? It guts Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Before, any state that had a history of discrimination had to check with the Justice Department before you change any of your voting laws. When the Supreme Court noticed in 2008, there was the highest number of African Americans ever recorded voted in that election. So what Justice Roberts does is he says, well, look, there's obviously no need for the Voting Rights Act. Obviously, we have no need for it because we've had more blacks voting than ever before. So let's just do away with this Section 5. There's no need for it. And the minute Section 5, within minutes, there were state legislatures, before the ink was dry on the decision, rushing to change their voting laws. They're not playing games. What's amazing about nationalism and white supremacy is that it's so well organized. Have you noticed? It's so well organized. Then you have Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, 2021. It upheld Arizona voting policies. It narrowed Section 2, right? Then you have the League of Women Voters versus Voters Education Fund versus Trump. It challenged federal citizenship documentation for voter registration. And then you have Calais versus Laundrie, 2025, a challenge on racial gerrymandering. And then this is a little bit outdated because guess what? 2026, you have the Calais decision that said what? Basically, Section 2 is also gutted. The last vestige of the Voting Rights Act is gone. And so this is where we are right now. I'm going to play this clip with me on former Texas Representative Beto O'Rourke. If you're familiar with him, he served as the representative from Texas's 15th Congressional District. He ran for president in 2020. He ran for governor of Texas in 2022. He's now involved in get out the vote efforts with young people in Texas.
No, where we are now today in Texas is a state where it is tougher to vote, tougher to register to vote than in any other state in the union. And it's not an accident. It's not a byproduct of anything else. It is the point and it is the purpose of the policies pursued by those who hold these positions of public trust and power in Texas right now. They're afraid of the future. They're afraid of the people that they purport to represent. They're afraid of voters. And so they've closed hundreds of polling places, more than in any other state. They've racially gerrymandered the congressional maps in Texas to disempower certain voters based on race and ethnicity. They've targeted young voters by removing polling places from college campuses or splitting campuses into separate polling precincts to confuse the voters who are there. They've added new restrictions on voting by mail. You know, let's say that you live in Denton, Texas. That's where you grew up, but you now go to school at the University of Houston. You might want to vote by mail to be able to cast a ballot in what's going to be a competitive state house and potentially congressional race up there in North Texas. But in 2022, the state government, in its voter restriction policies and new election laws, ended up rejecting nearly 13% of the mail-in ballots cast. So more than 1 out of every 10 mail-in ballots thrown out. The vote completely disregarded, that voice never heard. So that's the context for the work that we're doing. So within this incredibly restrictive environment that is focused on suppressing and intimidating voters across Texas, one where you have an incredibly onerous process to get registered. There's no online voter registration in Texas. We're one of like 6 or 7 states that don't do that. No automatic, no same-day voter registration. You literally have to get trained and certified as a volunteer deputy registrar, a VDR, within a given county, and there's 254 counties in Texas. Then you've got to go find the eligible unregistered future voter, meet them, help them if they need it in filling out a voter registration form. And then one thing that we do in our group, Powered by People, that I think is pretty unique is we stay in touch with that newly registered voter and become their voting Sherpa. You know, we are the most restrictive state when it comes to voting. And so it's understandable that a first-time voter, and maybe the first in their family to ever vote, might need a helping hand in making sure they know where their polling place is, when early voting starts, what the hours are, the form of ID that's going to be accepted by elections officials. This is the work that we're doing, and we've got to do this to overcome historic suppression and intimidation, to elect people into positions of public trust who will improve our voting laws to ensure that more of us can cast a ballot. And last thing, Mike, on this, sometimes this can come off as an abstraction or even academic, but it couldn't be more important to the lives of people in Texas. You have the most restrictive abortion ban in this country. It's exacerbating a maternal mortality crisis that's 3 times as deadly for Black women here in the state of Texas. You have a minimum wage that's $7.25 an hour. No one survives on that. So you're working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs to get by. We're the least insured state in America. More kids die of diabetes, totally preventable here in Texas than they do anywhere else. Public schools under attack, public school educators leaving the profession in droves. There are very real challenges that we have in Texas that will only be met when we have a fully functioning democracy that can elect leaders who are going to change the course that we're on and improve the lives of the people of Texas. So all of this is connected, but it all starts with voting. And it means that we've got to do everything we can to help those who are currently effectively and functionally prevented from voting to gain access.
So of course we talked about the recent moves to change, how much your vote can count. They're redrawing maps. Who paid attention to what happened in Texas last fall, when you had a proposal to redraw the maps in such a way to dilute Black and Hispanic vote turnout? The Democrats, they left, and it was a mess. And it all resulted in a change of the maps, because after 2 weeks of just protesting, they came back, they changed it. They moved with rapid speed to change the map in Mississippi. You see the filibuster. The filibuster is designed for debate. It's now used as a weapon of obstruction, right? So people say, well, if you have the majority, why can't you get these are the things that people don't understand. There are certain Senate rules, like the filibuster, certain things that prevent you from just having a up and down vote on certain issues, because it paralyzes the speed of legislation. It causes gridlock. So these are the things, as I'm wrapping things up, I want to play this. If you've ever watched Hardball from MSNBC's lineup, Chris Matthews, of course, is a student of history, someone who has a lot of insight. I want to play this clip. This was after the Democratic National Convention in 2024, the very Friday after the convention wrapped up.
The candidate.
Well, the trouble with that is, and I can go back to metaphors, and I can say Donald Trump is Ingemar Johansson. He's the Swedish guy that knocked out Floyd Patterson with his thunder and lightning punch, his one Sunday punch. And then, of course, Patterson, who everybody liked, all came back and beat him a couple of times. And it was just a fluke. The trouble with the fluke argument is that look at the polls now in Pennsylvania. Look at the polls in these states across the country. I mean, he's still at 47. And she's about 47, but she could climb or she could be reduced. It depends who gets control of this campaign the last 2 months. I don't think Trump is a fluke. I think he plays to an anger. It may be misplaced, displaced. It's the anger from the white guy, if you will, who seems to feel that people, and I don't feel this because obviously I was rooting for him. Barack Obama bugged people. Did you see, was it Michelle who said about the highly educated people, African Americans, and how it bothers people in her speech? I said, that's the first somebody of color has actually said that. But that's so true. Suppose you were a guy who barely gets out of high school. You got a job at the local gas station or truck delivery, and you're proud of yourself. You're making a few bucks, not much, but you're paying the bills. Kids aren't going to private school or anything, and you're not going on any fancy trips anywhere, but you're doing okay. And then you see this guy, Harvard Law, Columbia, and you look at her, Harvard Law, and you go, Jesus, where did I miss the boat? Did I miss one of the buses I'm supposed to have caught? And I think you go, how did he get there? And I'm still trying to make the next paycheck. And how'd that happen? And what's wrong with this system? What's the deal here? And so you can't chalk it up to affirmative action. That won't work because they're all really smart people. You can't do that. You listen to him talk. He talks like a guy who went to school, is educated. He probably watches sophisticated movies and stuff. I mean, you go, how'd this guy get there? And I think that's what bugs him. I don't think it's all in anger, and they're not all angry, but within their lives, they vote for Trump. I got family members like this. I'm telling you, they're good people, but they didn't get the breaks. Their family didn't think about college or law school or anything like that. They don't think like that. They didn't have those breaks or the kind of families that think like that. They just go out and get out of college and get a job. And that doesn't take you that far. And some guys, there's people like Spielberg and all those. You hear about guys that quit college and they go super speed. But most people say you got to get that degree. And so I think that's part of it. And I think cops, firemen, delivery guys, mechanics, plumbers, you know where they are. And they'll probably be nice to you, Michael. I don't think they're just person to person. They're angry, but they do feel they missed the bus. How else do you explain it? And they hate the IRS. They hate the FBI. They hate any bureaucrat that gives them trouble, whether parking tickets or speeding tickets. Or they're tired of property taxes, all the taxes they have to pay. They resent all that stuff. And yet they know there are people living below them in the ghetto, in the North Philly places. They know there are people that live in a lot worse lives than them. So they can't argue that they're especially ticked off. You can't logically say that, but there's a lot of attitude out there. And it's different. And part of it is rural.
So are you all enjoying this presentation? I'm wrapping things up. There was a book by a Harvard professor, a good friend of mine, if you've heard of the name, Steve Levitsky. Steve Levitsky wrote a book called The Tyranny of the Minority. He wrote another book, a secondary book to that, called How Democracies Die. How Democracies Die. I want to play a little clip of what he had to say. Before that, here's Jasmine Crockett.
And taxpayers and voters should all be offended that this is how they're spending their money when people in this country are still hurting. I know that we are experiencing record when it comes to job unemployment. It's at a record low as it relates to African Americans in this country. And we have so many things to brag about economically overall. If we're talking about the fact that the stock market is hitting record highs, there's so many things that we can talk about that are amazing. But the reality is that when you live in a capitalist society, there are always people that are struggling. That is what capitalism looks like. There will always be people that are struggling. And so the question is, will we go ahead and spend time trying to make sure that we can lessen the burdens of those that are struggling? And that's what we're not doing, because instead we're playing games, and people should be very offended, because while we know that the bottom wages are now going up instead of just those at the top making more, it's still not enough. People are still struggling. And so there's still more that we can do, whether it's looking at other drugs that we can reduce the prices on, especially these life-sustaining medications, or whether it's making sure that we are retooling people in this country as we are going to experience this transition into AI. And what does that look like? There's a lot of work that we really need to do, and we're not getting it done.
Secretary Leon Panetta. If you know Leon Panetta, this is the guy that was in the room when they took out Osama bin Laden. He was the former Secretary of Defense. Before that, he was the former CIA director. Listen to what he has to say. And again, this is all pertaining to democracy, okay? So why am I showing you these people? The secular world is realizing there's something crazy going on here. Have you noticed that that's the theme of what they're saying? That what used to be up is now down, and what's down is up, and they're drawing conclusions, right, based on voter behavior. But thank God we've got prophecy that allows us to see beyond the next election, right?
In your book, Mr. Secretary, Worthy Fights, you highlight the importance of international cooperation in combating terrorism, with Russia grappling with this devastating attack, how do you assess the effectiveness of current diplomatic efforts in fostering collaboration among nations to address transnational security threats?
Well, unfortunately, we're living at a time when there is a larger conflict going on between autocracies like Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorists whose principal goal is to try to undermine democracies in the world. Putin went in, tried to destroy democracy in Ukraine. The Hamas terrorists went in and tried to destroy democracy in Israel. And China is threatening to go after democracy in Taiwan. So the real effort now, I think, that's required by this dangerous world we live in, and the threat that autocrats are going to try to continue to undermine democracy, is that it is absolutely critical for the United States as a world leader to help to build and strengthen alliances throughout the world. It was important that the United States and NATO unified in saying to Putin that if he invades, that they would do everything necessary to help Ukraine, that they would apply sanctions against Russia, and that they would reinforce NATO, and they've done exactly that. I believe the challenge for the United States is going to be to build alliances elsewhere that can deal with threats in that area. For example, in the Middle East, I think it's important for us to build strong alliances with moderate Arab countries, with Israel, in order to confront both Iran and terrorism in that part of the world. I think it's important in Asia to build strong alliances in order to confront China and the threat from China. And we do. We've got a strong alliance with South Korea. We've got a strong alliance with Japan. We've got a strong alliance.
I'll curb that for the interest of time. But if you're interested, please see me, and I'll be glad to send you the clip or send you the episode. This is a podcast that I host, separate and apart. This is Stephen Zalitsky, who wrote the book that I just mentioned, How Democracies Die.
Does the fact that MAGA election deniers now sit in prominent House committees signal to you that the United States is undergoing a democratic breakdown? I'm asking that in light of the fact that in your book you talk about how the breakdown of democracies are no longer overt events where militaries engage in coups, but now we're starting to see the breakdown of democracies from within by elected leaders themselves. What do you say?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's a sign that American democracy is breaking down. In fact, for the most part, democracy is hanging in there. We survived the 2020 election. We survived the unprecedented effort to overturn the election violently. The 2022 election went reasonably well, without violence, without fraud. And so democracy is under threat. I mean, I agree with the majority of Americans who responded to that poll by saying that democracy is under threat, but it's not breaking down. What is worrisome, and this gets to your question, is that the Republican Party continues to be quite radicalized and quite extremist. It is not, as small d Democratic parties must do, it has not purged itself of violent and extremist elements. Democracies are only safe when mainstream political parties accept the results of elections, when mainstream political parties unambiguously renounce violence, and when mainstream political parties unambiguously break with extremist anti-democratic forces on their own flank. And the Republican Party is not doing any of those things, any of those three things consistently since Trump. And so Trump lost. Trump's star may or may not be on the political wane, but the extremist elements within the Republican Party not only are still there, but as you pointed out, are actually in the House caucus seem to be in ascent. So that's a bad sign. It's a worrisome sign. I'm not convinced that the Republican Party today is a party that's committed to playing by democratic rules of the game.
And of course, we've seen firsthand things, unprecedented things, the parallels between the United States and what happened in Brazil. I won't go into the details, but we talked about it already. You know it, you've seen it, you've lived it.
And of course, we've seen the influence that January 6th has had on other countries, specifically the country Brazil. Brazil has also experienced their January 6th like event.
But if you don't mind me saying, Mike, the Brazilians handled it better. So when Lula won the election and Bolsonaro lost on election night, every major right-wing politician, every one of Bolsonaro's major political allies, the right-wing governors of the largest states, the president of Congress, the equivalent of Ron DeSantis and Kevin McCarthy, all of them came out on election night and said, Lula won, too bad. It's time to turn the page and we're going to work with the new president. When January 8th happened in Brazil, it happened when protesters stormed all three branches of government, which is beyond what happened in the United States. Every major politician in the country immediately came out and denounced them. Nobody said it was like tourists visiting the Capitol. Nobody talked about false flag operations. Nobody said it was Antifa. Nobody called them heroes. All of them, everybody from left to right in the Brazilian political spectrum denounced it. Even Bolsonaro eventually denounced it. So that's the way that small d Democrats respond to a tragedy like January 6th. Unfortunately, the Republican Party, again, didn't respond that way. So Brazilians responded in a much more democratic or democracy-preserving fashion than the Americans did.
So I'm wrapping up. We see that there is something, like going back to what we said at the top of the hour, this is not a uniquely American issue, right? This is a phenomenon happening around the world. Authoritarianism is escalating. We see Project 2025. Do you know we're 80% in Project 2025? 80%. And we're scheduled to be at 90% by the early part of 27. This is not they are moving with rapid speed. They are taking away civil rights. His 2025 civil rights posture targeted not just DEI rhetoric. There was an article that said in 90 days, Trump erased 5 years of the civil rights era. 90 days. There was an executive order signed by Lyndon Johnson that said you cannot have any discrimination in the federal government. Gone. Rescinded. So this is serious. Of course, there's, of course, an executive order requiring proof of citizenship to vote. He has enacted a record number of executive orders. And this is not an attack on a particular person. We're talking about the channels through which large policy changes that result in institutional changes take place, right? There's a bigger picture here. The War Powers Act, the Congress voted toward votes on limiting his authority. But Congress was again debating whether to restrain war making after the executive had already acted. He already invaded Iran. So I'm going to go ahead and, this is the last slide. I will end here. We talked about the recent Supreme Court decisions, Trump versus Barbara. The court held that children born in the United States to parents who are unlawfully or temporarily present are still subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. But people started to celebrate, oh, great, the Supreme Court saved us. No. In the dissenting opinion, and if you know anything about jurisprudence, you know that the dissenting opinions often serve as the roadmap for future majority opinions. The dissenting opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson is largely what they were using, the people like Charles Hamilton Houston, right, who were Thurgood Marshall, arguing for Brown versus Board of Education. They were using that in the Brown versus Board of Education argument. So the ruling rejected Donald Trump's effort to narrow the citizenship clause and reaffirm the longstanding constitutional rule. However, Kavanaugh provides a roadmap for Congress to act. They are moving with deliberate speed. what's interesting about the right wing is that it's so patient. They will wait 40 years to overturn a president while we're celebrating that president's existence. And then when it's gone, it's like, what are we going to do now? Campaign finance. They decided, they struck down limits on coordinated party spending. Corporations, which are deemed people, can now spend unlimited sums of money into campaigns. So now churches can endorse candidates and corporations can spend unlimited sums of money. We're talking about democracy. But I thank you all for your attention. I hope this was an enlightening presentation. I'm ending there for the sake of time. With that being said, are there any questions or comments?
You know, Attorney Taylor mentioned the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, and this is a little anecdote I think you'll find interesting. Rutherford B. Hayes was at the time governor of Ohio, and after the proposal was made from the commission to remove the troops in exchange for Tilden giving Hayes the presidency, the political language at the time was we should adopt a policy of conciliation toward the South, and we should basically forgive and forget and so forth. And so Rutherford B. Hayes invites Frederick Douglass to the governor's mansion in Columbus, Ohio, and asks Frederick Douglass, should I, because he had already been elected, and like you said, Mike, he was waiting for March 4th, 1877 to be inaugurated. Rutherford B. Hayes invites Douglass up to the governor's mansion in February and says, Mr. Douglass, what should I do? He said, what do you think should happen? And Frederick Douglass responded by saying, this is a quote. He said, Governor, do not cast your pearls before swine. He said, the South must know that there is a God in Israel. That's a quote from Frederick Douglass. And then he went on to say, if you do this, you are going to set the cause of black people back a long way. And of course, I don't know why he invited Douglass to ask his advice, because as soon as he got inaugurated, he followed through with it, and everybody knows what happened after that, after the troops left the South. So that's an interesting anecdote, and I love the way Douglass used scripture to speak truth to power in that moment.
Thank you. And just going back on Douglass's interactions with presidents, when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, well, first of all, when Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated in March of 1865, his vice president is drunk, smells of whiskey, and is just, he can't even, in fact, there's a moment where he almost topples over that they have to sit him down. Frederick Douglass goes to shake Andrew Johnson's hand, and Andrew Johnson gives him this grimacing look like, how dare you extend your hand to me? So Frederick Douglass writes, whatever could be said of this man, he's no friend of our race. That's the man who becomes president during the greatest attempt at democracy. When Abraham Lincoln is killed in Ford's Theater, he ascends to the presidency, and Andrew Johnson now is facing what they call a radical Republican Congress, that they're not interested in bipartisanship. They said, we have the numbers, let's run through the votes. Thaddeus Stevens, who is the, I think he's the majority leader, he's like, we have the votes, there's no, well, my friend from across the aisle, let's just get together and have a drink. No, we've got the numbers, let's ram through the 13th Amendment. Okay, we got that, ram through the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They were ramming through the most progressive agenda during the most anti-civil rights president. The irony speaks for itself. In fact, during the 1866 midterm elections, Andrew Johnson goes on a tour called the Swing Around the Circle to campaign against this radical Republican Congress and what they're doing to extend black rights. History is amazing, and I just wanted to throw that in there as we're talking about Frederick Douglass's interactions with presidents.
Evangelical Christians, are they making a great influence in the Republicans?
Are the evangelical Christians? Well, yes, they are. I saw a recent poll that showed that about 80% of them supported the current administration's run for 2024 and in 2020, right? There are many who, and it's not just evangelical. The scary thing is many of that ideology is creeping into our own pews. It's there loud, and this is the evangelical agenda runs on this grievance that if they can legislate morality, then all will be saved. Christ said, "My kingdom is not of this world," right? What's amazing about the evangelical movement is how willing they are to overlook blatant things. You see, look, Paula White and all of these folks putting their hands on. Paula White said to say no to Donald Trump is to say no to God himself. Direct quote. They're not playing games. And we think this is about Trump. When Trump moves on, because he's about 80 years old, he's not going to be here forever, there will be another body that they use as an avatar. The movement has been around since Jerry Falwell, 1978, 79. In fact, Jimmy Carter, when he loses to Ronald Reagan, he's on Air Force One, and they said, "Well, what was the most painful part about this campaign to you?" He said, "The most painful part was when Jerry Falwell looked into the camera and said, 'Now we'll have a real Christian in the White House.'" Talking about Ronald Reagan, right? That's the most painful part. Now, it's amazing. This movement is over a generation years old. And it's only become more, they've developed school curriculums. You've got people like Charlie Kirk. Do you understand what they're doing now? They're moving to eliminate the 14th Amendment. 20 years ago, that's crazy, come on, 14th Amendment. How can you, Charlie Kirk pushed the removal of the 14th Amendment. He pushed the removal of Martin Luther King Day, right? And we'll think, well, what's the big deal? It's just a holiday. Well, if you remove Martin Luther King Day, and if you discredit the leader of the civil rights movement, you can discredit the movement. You see, we're thinking simple. Oh, this is about a holiday. No, this is not about a holiday. They're going after the very infrastructure that was in place. We've only been a democracy for a period of 48 years. From the time the Voting Rights Act was signed by Johnson to Shelby versus Holder, 23, that's 48 years. 48 years. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Go back to the birthright citizenship decision. And either one of you could respond because you both touched on it. One of the points that I believe was made, well, in Kavanaugh, what I understood him to say was that the framers of the 14th Amendment, what they intended at the time was diplomats who came, to the U.S. weren't allowed to, if they had children in U.S. soil, that those children would not, claim the right to citizenship. But I wonder, and so what his point, I guess Kavanaugh's point now is saying that if you're here temporarily or if you're here illegally, then your children should not earn the rights to be citizens. But I think what I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, from what Ketanji said was, this is not related, well, not related. It's not necessarily about the 14th Amendment in that context. It's about getting rid, like right now in modern times, not allowing families of color, to have citizenship rights here in the U.S. So I wanted to get your feedback on that because I think a part of me just wonders. Initially, I thought, well, is there something to consider? I am an immigrant. I'm a U.S. citizen now, but I am an immigrant. And I wondered, what are your thoughts on both points? And how do we understand, I guess, or how can we understand what is happening even more deeply with this birthright citizenship and the opinions of the judges?
Well, what's interesting about Ketanji Brown, and Dr. Golden, I think, did an excellent job encapsulating what the essence of her argument was. But notice how Clarence Thomas always talks about colorblindness when it comes down to other advancement of rights. Right, we're colorblind. Equal Protection Clause, affirmative act, we're colorblind. But all of a sudden, he can see color when it comes down to this particular issue. And so Ketanji Brown Jackson calls him out on that. You can't have it both ways. And in fact, she even in the argument says that African Americans have opened the floodgates for all other immigrants to be able to advance and move forward and have rights. So this is not a uniquely black issue like he tried to portray it. This is an issue that affects a multiracial coalition. And so it's interesting because what he tries to do is pigeonhole it to make it as unique and specific to a particular group of people. And if he can do that, then of course they make the argument of favoritism and reverse discrimination. Dr. Golden, I'm going to go ahead and let you take.
So I think that what the appeal of what Clarence Thomas is arguing for is strong, because he's talking about Dred Scott and what Dred Scott meant and how the Reconstruction Congress is trying to correct Dred Scott. But what he's not accounting for is, number one, what Justice Jackson talked about, which was the more universal goal of black political activists during Reconstruction, of making sure the Citizenship Clause applied to more than just black people. But most conservative judicial opinions completely overlook that 23-year period in which the very institution that they're a part of, the Supreme Court, didn't make sure that black people would not get any help from the federal government at all, right? From the slaughterhouse cases through Plessy versus Ferguson, it was the Supreme Court that was responsible for paving the way to that kind of white racial terror against black people that continued with black codes, Jim Crow, lynching, the convict leasing system, all the way up to the 20th century. I mean, let's not forget, Medgar Evers was shot and killed in his driveway for registering black voters in Mississippi in 1963. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. The Voting Rights Act didn't become law until 95 years later. So, I don't know, does that help answer your question?
And correct me if I'm wrong, what he thought, the reason the 14th Amendment, the framers framed it so that diplomats initially, right, could not, right?
So I think that the argument of Trump's Solicitor General, John Sauer, was this argument that the phrase, so the Citizenship Clause says, all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. I think what you're talking about didn't so much come from Kavanaugh. It came from the arguments made before the court that that phrase, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, meant that you were domiciled in the United States and that you had no allegiance to a foreign power. Clarence Thomas says that clearly applies to black people, but does not apply to people who are here illegally that have children, because they don't have the kind of domicile here in the United States that black people had. That was the argument of the Solicitor General. Brett Kavanaugh's argument was that the president's executive order did not violate the 14th Amendment. He says that point blank. Then he says the president's executive order did violate this federal statute. And if Congress wants to make sure it doesn't violate this federal statute, all they have to do is adjust some of the language, incorporate some of Trump's language from the executive order, and then birthright citizenship could be eliminated. But then he says Congress hasn't done that yet. So, yeah, wink nod.
And that means only that it could happen within the next a Republican administration. And that's assuming things go right for the opposition party this November. Right.
Well, there's no.
Right, no, I mean, it was basically a 5-4 decision, which is, to me, is way too close to Trump. That
Yeah.
decision should have been unanimous, 9-0.
And so what we're seeing now is, when there's going to be a time in the recent, in a not too distant future, where that is birthright citizenship is redefined, and there'll be protesting and gnashing of teeth, and people, I can't believe this. But this, these are the moments that really build moments like that. And if we're not paying attention, we'll be swept up with the majority of people tuning into cable news to figure out what the next steps are. We already know. We know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I want to say that the problem, and I've listened to Clarence Thomas' reasoning. His reasoning was very. He almost brought in kind of like dark age reasoning. Like the parents are subject to a foreign place, and it was almost like because they're subject to a foreign place, then the baby automatically becomes subject to that place. But there's so many, and practically speaking, there's so many problems with that. Because, like, for example, if you have people who come over from Haiti, right, and they have temporary protected status, and they have children, right? So then now what happens with their children that were born on American soil? You see, it just caused so many issues. Another issue I have, too, is the hypocrisy of this all, because sometimes they sound good theoretically, but when you actually spin the wheels, it tears the whole framework of the country into pieces. And if you notice, from my understanding, when they were making arguments, Trump was saying, we don't want this to be retroactive. We wanted to start from this time period. And the reason for that is a lot of them came in on birthright citizenship.
John McCain was born on a ship in the Panama Canal.
The very people making the arguments
right.
They don't have American heritage.
Yeah.
So it's like, I want freedom for myself, but I don't want anybody else after me to have it. And they were saying the Miller guy, the crazy guy, that's kind of Stephen Miller, Trump, all these people, their parents, grandparents came over here fleeing persecuted. That his dad didn't want to be in the military in Germany, fled over here, and so it's kind of like they got the keys, and now they want to take it from everybody else. So that's the hypocrisy of it. Rubio, all of them, Cruz, Ted Cruz, these guys, like.
And if they're not, if it doesn't apply to them, they married someone, right? Who got their citizenship like every other person who was not born here. Ted Cruz was born in Canada.
Yeah, and Ted Cruz's wife is an Adventist. Yeah, his wife's an Adventist. And so, but look, all of this is when any analysis of the Trump administration has to begin and end with the fact that he is a convicted criminal. And I say that because what are we talking about? We're talking about a complete upheaval of law. It's a complete upheaval of law, a complete upending of the legal status quo, and none of us should be surprised because despite his oath to faithfully execute the laws, it seems practically he's faithfully breaking them at every turn. And that should not surprise us because we knew he was a convicted criminal when we voted for him. And when I say we, I'm not talking about directly me and you, but what I am saying is in the kind of democratic republic, as Attorney Taylor pointed out, that we live in, even though we didn't vote for Trump, we all got to live with the consequences, right? Even though you may not have voted for him, you still got to live with what he's doing. So, sometimes I think we need to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what does his election, despite his criminality, say about us?
Isn't that interesting that this is not the first time humanity was placed with a two-person vote and they chose the convicted felon? What was Barabbas? He was an insurrectionist and a convicted felon. And we're all living with the consequences today. Well, thank God. because we needed Christ's sacrifice. But sometimes the Bible gives us precedents, I guess, to look at spiritually that sometimes we overlook.
For the refugees, do you think the Know Your Rights is kind of protective of them? Have you heard of the Know Your Rights? Know Your Rights for the immigrants and refugees? No, do you know your rights? So we're sharing with the immigrants and refugees to know what their legal rights, what their rights are, but it doesn't stop the ICE and everything, but to know your rights, the political, and especially in the state of Washington, for immigration attorneys and.
There are. Well, first of all, we have to. Anyone who goes to law school, Pastor Kerwin Jones will tell you, Pastor Golden, no right is absolute. The First Amendment right is not absolute. You can't incite violence. You can't say words that would cause incitement to violence or, what they would deem fighting words, right? You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. We understand that there are certain organizations, thank God, that do inform the communities about the certain rights, but we also know that police are given a great degree of deference. Who's heard of probable cause? All a police officer needs in order to either search a vehicle, right, is reasonable suspicion to believe that crime has been committed. And what would they base that reasonable suspicion on? A lot of times the court says, well, based on your 2 years experience, 5 years experience, 10 years experience, you as an officer understand what someone who is accused of XYZ would do. Go ahead and open up the vehicle and find whatever you can find to incriminate them. I'm just using the Fourth Amendment as an example, but I'm just saying we understand the courts gave great deference to those who wear the color of law. So a lot of times when we see civil rights victories, so-and-so filed a Section 1983 claim against this particular officer. It's not as straightforward as you may think. Because a lot of times the courts give deference, especially courts that are appointed by Republican administrations on the state level and national level, that believe in making sure that you get rid of a certain level of buffer that holds police officers accountable, right? Which is why there's even a call from Turning Point USA to pardon Derek Chauvin or to re-examine his case, even though he was convicted by a jury of his peers of murder, right? So this is important. Know your rights are important, and they have their place. But the challenge with those organizations is that the definition of those rights is constantly changing, and not in our benefit. Any other questions? Well, I'll leave you with this. Of course, by the end of the second Trump term, America will display warning signs. Have we seen them? Yes, we have. We're currently still seeing them. Scholars usually associate with failing democracies abroad, the weakening of independent institutions, political violence, disinformation campaigns. Have you noticed even the certain television shows that you watch are now suspect? If they don't like the particular news organization or comedian, they can go use the FCC. I mean, these are things that we've never really experienced or even conceived of before. And this is why, I was listening to, I don't know if you watch PBS's This Week, there was a group of constitutional scholars who were getting ready to commemorate the 250th anniversary of America. The moderator says, what would you change, scholars, if you could go back in time, 250 years? One person said, the brilliance of the founders and framers were so, second to none. I wouldn't change anything. So another person said, I would change, how it addressed slavery. But what I think is that a lot of the Constitution, have you noticed, is based on an honor system? An honor system that you assume that the person who loses the election leaves office, their wife has tea with the incoming first lady, there's a ratification of the vice president to certify the election, everything goes according to plan, and we just have a peaceful transfer of power, the end. And it's been that way until 245 years into the experiment, 2021. And a lot of this is based on the fact that all goodwill, you know. Oh, George Washington, he went back to Mount Vernon after 2 terms, and every president followed suit if they, you know, until Franklin Roosevelt said, I'm running for 4 times, right? And so I'm just saying there's certain things that have been just taken for granted as always going to be here when there's no set law that requires it to be here. With that being said, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I enjoyed being with you this Sabbath. And if there are no more questions, that concludes my presentation. With us, and so we just thank you so much. I'm sure everybody got their questions answered. I was on uncle duty, trying to bathrooms and crying and all kind of stuff. So, yeah. So anyway, so I guess everybody's had their questions answered. Everybody's kind of see what's going on with the 14th Amendment. That's to me. I think we might have mentioned that, but I feel like that's the main agenda. Because if they can overturn the 14th Amendment, everything else unravels with it. And so they want to go back to pre-Civil War America, in my opinion. So, when they want to roll back, what's the women's rights? They got the right to vote. That's the 19th Amendment, right?